Body. State Board of Education has some skin in the game to direct other EPs or other institutions who are doing a great job or aspirants to provide assistance and ideas to people struggling. And then you get an additional 3 data cycles and standard funding ceases when the standard is met. So I don't know if this makes any sense or not, or whether we need to work this out. I just thought it might be an opportunity to get some other people held responsible and accountable for something that we hear as a statewide effort across a number of different stakeholders. This is an issue. That was it in a nutshell.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Lawrence, are you there?
Yeah, yes, I'm here now.
Because the live streaming isn't working. I'm sorry to interrupt. Lawrence, are you there?
Yes. Yes, we had a problem with the live streaming, but now we had a problem with it, but now it should be working now. You hear me?
Well,
this is Andrew. It's from the field. They're saying they think IT addressed it, so I think we're good to go now.
okay, great. Thank you.
And thank you for folks in the field for letting us know. Appreciate that. So, sorry for the interruption there. So, Dr. Weddington, or rather, the people on this call, what are your initial thoughts on the idea of sort of a separate, sort of a second side of things associated with this? Obviously, that's sort of may complicate things in terms of process, but there are some new thoughts in there that I thought would be helpful for this group to react to.
Hank, could you talk a little bit about sort of the inverse incentive relationship that you get funding from the General Assembly if you don't succeed versus front loading it for everybody?
Well, I would rather have it front loaded for everybody. I was just thinking if we're going to have sanctions attached to this, it would be nice if they were more of the carrot type, like our legislators talked about when we met with them, as opposed to it just being punitive. But I think we still always push for the fact that we need funding. That's correct. I was just looking at some way that if we had to have sanctions attached to this, and that actually get out under the ad tier.
So, so does this mean? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Michael. You're fine.
Is that Andrew? Okay, I was just going to ask. So, essentially, would we be saying that we would strip the diversity component from what we've been talking about, and then the commission would essentially create a new recommendation to create a standard around diversity? Which you know, we certainly could do that, right? I mean, that's within the purview of this commission. So it's separate from the legislation. This would be our own action separate from the legislation, I think is what I'm trying to say.
I think that's right, Michael. I guess that's the way that I was. almost like its own dashboard, track still sees.
Right.
Showing that it's important to us, but maybe not tied up to performance issues to deal with.
Yeah, so the performance is one issue going forward, but then this diversity, the diversity metrics would be a completely separate recommendation.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of liked it separated. And I think it addresses the state board's concern.
If you took that approach, would you lose any accountability, or would there be room for an institution not to be committed to that work in this space? Just a question. I'm trying to think it through.
Yeah, Dr. Graham, I was actually just thinking that it's actually a separate accountability provision that we recommended to the state board, and the state board would actually put it in place. And so you could have sanctions and everything else attached in the same way, but it's just a separate standard that we've put in. That's the way I'm thinking about it. I don't know if other folks agree with that or not.
Yeah, that's how I'm. That's what came up for me too. I mean, I think to that point, and Hank, I maybe have a clarifying question, and just want to make sure I understand your kind of rationale there. Because I think I have pause, and I think you brought up last time just that, your biggest worry here is that you could receive a sanction for something that we're going to have to grow our agency to change, and maybe more difficult for some, EPPs early on than others. So pulling it out as a standalone, I mean, I guess generally I would say, I think the composite model across the board is just better framework. But even in this case, I actually wonder if pulling it out actually makes Anne's concern more likely. I mean, honestly, one of the things when I went back and looked at what Andrew at Saberg had pulled together was, I think it had kind of assuaged any concern that, this was going to be sanctionable for folks if we offered the three pathways. It didn't appear that there would be many sanctions handed out, but if you pull it out alone, particularly because it was only going to be weighted at a certain amount. So even if somebody struggled and didn't meet the threshold, it still wouldn't have led to sanctions in a composite model. But if you pull it out, then I can imagine it actually does become more of a concern. And maybe we want that. But Hank, I'd be curious to kind of hear your rationale there.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. The composite, I totally agree. I don't hurt people that much. I think my thinking was more along the lines of, is there a way that we can make a really strong statement to General Assembly and the state board to say, we want other people to have accountability in the system with us. Those alternative sanctions for this particular standard, we can build those in. Whereas with the other ones, I'm not so sure about those are performance indicators that we have a lot of control over. So I think it was more about finding a way, and maybe it could be written into the sanctions that are part of the composite model, specifically dealing with diversity. I just think it would be nice to be able to have others involved in the shifting institution, because I think it's incredibly important. We all want to help yesterday with folks. So I think it's something that we're all striving for. It would be great to, if you were to go on probation or a warning, that there would be somebody else held accountable along to try to make this better, given our limits of power within the system commissions.
This is Ann. I hope you can hear me. I'm on the phone. So I wondered if there's a way to marry the two, like if we stick with our composite model, which I do think, since that alone is bold, in my opinion, at this point, no one, we haven't really found anyone that tested it out, so to say, in another state. So it is making a bold move. While it may not have all the teeth that everybody wants in it, it is a bold move. But is there a way to put some of this other language around support and that kind of stuff in with what we're doing? Hank, you may have just said that. I'm having a hard time hearing you for some reason. But I apologize if I'm repeating.
Yeah, for me, pulling it out of the composite model, where I'm struggling is, so we've got this governor's task force focused on diversifying the teacher workforce. And in that task force, we're really trying to drive toward thinking about how do we ensure things are baked into the cake, if you will. So the composite model, in a way, bakes into the system a way to assess and monitor and track our efforts in the space of diversity. So I worry that pulling it out kind of moves away from what I think the task force is wanting to see more of. So I'm just in my mind trying to figure out how to marry these things or how to reconcile them so that we're flowing in the same direction, as opposed to perhaps creating these undercurrents where we're working against certain things.
Dr. Graham, this is Andrew Seibert jumping in for a second. Could you share at all any of the strategies along the diversity component that might be in place that is a requirement of the public system? That's something that may be useful to hear if there are specific components.
Yeah, we're in the infancy stages, Andrew, so it's hard to really speak to some of those specifics. I mean, we literally just started meeting, I guess, 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to get too far ahead, but we really are focusing almost myopically in terms of race and ethnicity at this point. But we haven't gotten too far beyond that in the conversations of diversity. Kim, I'm going to kick it to you for a second and let you see if there's anything that I'm saying that might be off base based on what you've heard in the conversation so far.
No, I think we're just starting the discussion.
Yeah.
I mean, I do
Anthony,
think.
this is Ann.
Oh, go ahead, Ann.
I was wondering, Anthony, I mean, my understanding is y'all are also, because I have one of our wonderful faculty members on that committee,
Mm-hmm.
that you're also trying to really focus on strategy, right?
Right.
That's part of which I do think mirrors with this work. So if that works, right? If that task force, and Van, I know you're on it too, so you can chime in. If that works, you can identify some strategies that will certainly mirror, the results should be seen in a composite model here. So I think that is parallel in terms of marrying in the composite model. So good job.
Absolutely. I agree, Ann.
Yeah, I'm glad you all brought that up because I actually think this is a really important development. And I was really excited to see the overlap in this subcommittee or these two subcommittees and membership on the task force. Because I think one of the things that we've come back to and I think makes a lot of sense is, we can do what's in our lane and add, diversity into the composite accountability framework, but that isn't enough. We're still going to actually need to have kind of a comprehensive approach across the state, with potential financial incentives, strategic clarity, and perhaps even policy levers pulled. And so I know there's a lot of work and you all are in the infancy stages, but it does make me think, if we can get the accountability framework set up, I have less concerns that, we're going to be a standalone on this and there's not more coming on that front.
Absolutely, Andrew. I agree.
Yeah, I agree with what the other members of the the DRIVE Task Force have said. One piece in what Hank has crafted is the lag time piece. I think we need to pull that into the accountability model because obviously you got to build the cohort And for undergrads in particular, that takes you don't know for 2 years whether or not you've been able to get them over to education. So that's a definite. I personally am a little bit nervous about inviting the General Assembly into educator preparation program work when I think they have significant overreach in many ways now. So that just makes me a little bit nervous. And then I also would be concerned, Hank, that last sentence in part 3, that given what the members of the state board have already told us, the idea of perpetual probation takes any teeth out of it. It's no longer an accountability mechanism because there's no effect on the program in being on probation, other than being on probation.
Yeah, I was kind of shooting pretty high there, for sure. And again, these are just some initial thoughts, and I agree. I don't want to simply be more involved, and they have to be. I know that we've talked throughout that we're going to need help on this, and this governor's task force is really moving in the direction where it's sympathizing. I'm great with that. I just didn't want us to miss an opportunity to be able to make sure that others were helping in the effort.
Also, Anthony, back to our conversation yesterday on the DRIVE task force, the members of the task force have been charged explicitly with reaching out to other stakeholder groups to pull ideas and insights into the work of the task force. And so there are folks like us, Anthony and me, who are on that, and the person at Elon we've been asked to bring in thoughts and ideas from places like PEPSC.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I've heard a couple really good things here. So I'm wondering, let me see if I can sort of push this together to try and keep it moving forward. It sounds to me like maybe the idea of trying to make the Tennessee model work and try and incorporate some of the things that we've heard in Dr. Weddington's suggestion into that model. Is that what I'm hearing?
Andrew, I'm not sure I followed you there.
Well, I heard earlier the comments from Dr. Bullock about the composite model being sort of the strongest idea that we have to date, and then I'm hearing there's some interest in some of the things that have been suggested insofar as trying to capture the different components that are incorporated into Dr. Weddington's initial ideas. And can those two be married somehow, I guess is the next question. And the answer can be no, it can, Andrew, and that's fine.
I mean, I'll throw this out there because in my brain it's making sense, and it may just not be where we're at, or I might be missing something. I mean, if we're going to go with a composite model, which again I feel strongly we should, based off of Tennessee, just comprehensive model across the board, not just for diversity, then in my mind, we would just add race and gender like we talked about last time, but we would just weight it lower, and maybe it's 50 20 20 10, and then we add it in, but that we start with the two categories that the state board explicitly asked for. We move towards that. Sounds like the lag would need to be built in, just so we're being realistic about when we'd be able to measure cohorts, but that's not waiting through a pilot. That's just actually saying when the data would be available. and that we would, keep it simple. I mean, push for the comprehensive model with the 3 we already had, adding, racial and gender diversity as a 4th with a lower weight, tying the sanctions to the comprehensive model and not, each domain, and that we would, take that, back to the state board. Probably could reconvene that group of state board members just to make sure they feel, that this is doable, and that, we're not going to send it to them and lose the chance to move something forward. And then if they are in agreement and we're in agreement with that approach, then we could take it to the commission for vote.
So, Ms. Dan, so I have a question for the drive vote. How are you defining diversity in your task force? I just want to make sure if we're going to match, we've got what they've got.
Yeah, right now we haven't offered a concrete definition of diversity, and as we're thinking about it in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, geography, and the conversations we've been having, from what I can gather. But in terms of we haven't operationalized a definition that I see at this point being comfortable to be able to say these are the things that we should consider in this conversation as we think about metrics to assess diversity.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Helpful. So, okay, I'll say something else now, as you know. 16. So my other question would be, is we could come back, would we have the opportunity to come back, if we started with the things that Andrew Lincoln said, would we have the opportunity, if the drive votes change their definitions or broaden their definitions, could we come back and add those in? Because we had talked about things like first gen, parenting for rural areas, stuff like that. So, which to me is somewhat of geography. So I'm curious if we think that would happen or not.
Well, this is Andrew. I mean, I think, there's no doubt that this is going to be an evolving thing, right? Because whatever gets approved and recommended by this group ultimately goes to the board. If it gets approved there, it has to go to in terms of it being an actual accountability model, it has to be written into law. The law has to change. So there's stakeholders on that end that have to do something. And obviously, if there are other major stakeholder groups that are invested in this, the learnings and the ideas that are coming out from these other areas should obviously inform, but they're not there yet in terms of actually moving the needle. This group is the first group and the furthest along. So my guess is that the drive group will probably look at what's going on here and think very carefully about how that influences their own thinking, and sort of back and forth. So I think this is a starting point, but it's certainly well within the purview of this group to make continuous modifications and recommendations as it goes forward, as it learns more, as it collects more data. So I think it's an evolving thing.
Yeah, Andrew, I would ask Ken and Ken to chime in here, but I would definitely agree. This group is much farther along in terms of our thinking relative to diversity. And I do think what's happening here will influence to some extent the conversations that we will have with the Drive Task Force. So I do think the time we've spent almost over a year now talking and working through this is positioned us quite nicely, I think, to do some things differently. But I do agree with Andrew Lackas that I think the composite approach, kind of mirroring what's happening in Tennessee, makes the most sense for me.
Well, okay, so if there's no strong opposition to thinking about this Tennessee model, then I'm wondering if we could open up the Tennessee or the accountability model V10, and I want to share some places where I ran into some bumps along the road to see how you all might react to some of these things. And if Dr. Tomerlin is on, with his background in doing this kind of stuff a lot, I would certainly welcome his input as well. And Kim, can you, looks like you're working on it. So for those of you who have documents in front of you, it would be accountability B10.
I shared it. Do you see it?
I do not see it. Do others see it? Ah, there we go.
Okay.
Perfect. So, and just to walk through some of these things, you know, what I tried to do is put as much stuff in here and get a model as close as I possibly could to complete. And where I ran into a challenge has to do with growth. So if you click on the tab that says D4% growth, so again, it's a reminder for everybody on the call. We're thinking about this diversity domain three different ways. One is to think about a state standard. One is to think about how an EPP compares to its own institution, and in terms of its diversity, and whether or not they can move in some set point in terms of growth year over year. And the problem that I ran into, I didn't have any problem with the percent institution versus EPP. I didn't have any problem setting a state standard and putting that together. But if you look at the growth under column D, the growth is all over the place, and the size of the institution is certainly impacting that as well. And so it's not easy for me to just say, here is the cut point by which you would set a standard for a yes or a no. And again, the idea here would be, and this is going back to what Tennessee's model was initially, and what I heard captured really nicely from Mr. Lakis, was this idea of, you know, you have to meet one of these three components in order to be in compliance for this domain. So if you're trying to think of a yes/no, you met the standard of growth. I'm not sure how to calculate growth, given that the range that we're looking at is anywhere from 423% to minus 100% in the data that we're looking at.
Which column are you looking at, Andrew?
I'm looking at column D in the third tab, and the tab at the bottom is D4% growth.
Okay.
So what you're seeing is, in column B, we're looking at the percentage of non-white completers by institution from 17 and 18. We're looking at the same strategy for 18-19, and then we're looking at the growth between those, you know, from one to the next. And then I also provided the sample size of those two groups, so you can see the difference in the size. If we're going to go down this path, this is hard to figure out how to, or I'll qualify that. It's hard for me to figure out how to do that.
Andrew, this is Tom. Do you mind if I say something here?
No, I'm promoting it. I'm encouraging it.
Okay.
Please, jump in.
So I think one way to possibly do this is to look at rather than look at the growth from one year to the next, and a percentage increase or decrease of that growth. I mean, I think what we're all going to experience in this is some variation in how well we do. Like one year we may increase it by 30%, and then the next year we find that it drops by 15. And that's to be expected, I think, to some degree. What you could do to kind of guard against that is to, for every year, you construct a confidence interval around so whatever your base year is, 17, 18, you construct a confidence interval around that percentage and that's basically your no detectable change rate range. And so you don't get points, but you also don't get penalized if you stay within that confidence interval. If you dip below it, that would be a change. I mean, that would be a negative change that has some kind of consequence to it or notice about it. And then positive change would garner you positive points in the accountability model. That's just a suggestion looking at kind of the way you constructed it right there. So, but I have to say that is going to advantage small districts because your small IHEs will have much larger confidence intervals, but in your larger IHEs will have very narrow confidence. I didn't mean to kill the conversation.
No, I mean, part of me is trying to process everything you're sharing, Tom and Andrew. I'm not a statistician. What I will just name, because I got to bring to life, is that as I looked at this data the other day, the need for this to be part of the accountability framework has never been more clear to me. And I know I've been trumpeting this for a long time, but I mean, the fact that if you offer these 3 pathways, one of them, there's 4 people or 4 institutions that would have got a yes, and the other 2, there's maybe about half. And then in particular, the downward trend from 2017-18 to 2018-2019, honestly, is just staggering to me. I mean, and that's not nobody's at fault. There's not a problem here, but it's like, this is why I think we started out on this journey. And our friends in Tennessee started on this journey, is that if we don't prioritize this and at least have some system, even if it's responsive, for holding, EPPs accountable to this, the problem's not taking care of itself, I guess, is maybe what I would suggest here.
Hey, Tom, this is Van. I like the way you phrased that, and I hope it is recorded. So what you're basically saying is each EPP gets a band or range, and as long as it doesn't hit the guardrails on either side, it doesn't get punished or doesn't benefit unless it goes below the guardrail or above the guardrail.
Correct.
Okay.
And those guardrails would be, I want to be clear, would be a function of the size of the institution. Either way we would construct that, the relative size would make that smaller the institution, the larger the guardrails. The larger the institution, the smaller the guardrail.
Right. But again, I'm looking at UNC Wilmington's row. It sort of gives us 2 guideposts. Number 1, you want to set a benchmark where performance gets better. We increase the number, but at a minimum, don't fall out of this band.
Yeah. Now, so you'd have to. So here's the problem with that particular strategy: is what if you year after year drop in your enrollment, but it's always within the confidence band?
Yeah.
You would have to want to have some kind of safeguard built around that. So, you can't have a small incremental downward slope and remain kind of fine. You'd have to build some rules around that, but at least when I look at this, when I look at something like, when I look at Eastern Carolina, as large as that program is that, is that a meaningful drop? And in that case, it probably is, but maybe looking something, what Chowan University, you know, that 10% drop or that 16.7% drop when you only have 3 students, is that meaningful? Or is that just normal wobble in the, you know, what we would expect from differences from year to year that we don't want to necessarily ascribe any kind of meaning to. We just know that it happens sometimes. I guess that's what I would try to guard against, is that, you know, non-informative wobble in the stats.
Other thoughts?
Am I correct that, so this would be an annual measure, obviously, to see if we're staying guardrails, but where it will become a consequence in certain periods of time to see how we compare to the baseline year after 5 years, whatever we set, or would this truly be an annual measure where sanctions or potential sanctions like based on because again, having enough lag time to be able to do something about what you're seeing, or to have that to down or whatever else.
Dr. Weddington, going forward, can you talk about 10% louder?
Sure, respect your mind. Can you hear me now better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. I just wondered, I think in past conversations, we had talked about looking at growth over a certain number of years, right? Not annual measure necessarily, although there would be measures, but there would come a consequence after so much data was collected. Just wondering, does this shift it to an annual measure that something's triggered based on those, or are we going to build in time for IHEs or EPPs to actually make some changes for anything?
Right. So let me jump in on there. The thing I shared last time, which was that very detailed investigation of the diversity of the institution compared to the EPP, we were looking at that and thinking about how do we grow by setting the standard is that EPPs will mirror the diversity of the institutions in which they reside. In this particular model, that was less of a discussion point to think about that over the course of 10 years or 6 years or whatever it is that we would think of. This was more about looking at, can we annually look at the data, which is what the law currently says, is to have an accountability model that's looking at annual outcome measures and come up with a strategy that we could look at. And in this case, it's you meet one of the 3 criteria in diversity, yes or no. And if you do, then you're fine. And if you don't meet any of those criteria, then a potential loss of points in the grand scheme of things. So they are 2 different things. That doesn't mean that we can't think about that, but it does make the idea of looking at everything else year over year, and then this slightly more complicated.
Tom?
Yes.
In the context of the caveats that you shared about the confidence interval strategy,
Yeah.
can you give us a balance of the problems that creates versus the usability of the model it creates? I mean, how much does the confidence interval structure worry you?
I mean, it doesn't worry me in that it actually gives me more confidence that districts aren't going to be held accountable for kind of random shocks to the system. Like, for whatever reason, this year, our efforts didn't yield as much. It it doesn't indicate a, you know, you might have differences that aren't indicative of a lack of your concerted effort to attract diverse candidates to the school system. There was just something that happened that year that may be anomalous, that you didn't get as many as you wanted. So that confidence interval kind of protects you from saying, well, it's, you didn't meet the standard this year, that's a ding. The thing that worries me is that it could promote a status quo mentality around it. Well, as long as I don't do worse, I'm doing okay. And that's fine. That could be mitigated by how you weight that within the overall system. So I want to go back to Hank's issue of, is this an annual measure? Well, it wouldn't have to be. What you could simply do is evaluate every year within the cohort. Let's say we're doing a 3-year band for reporting out on this. Every year you get, a plus, a neutral, or a minus as your performance in that year, and then you kind of holistically evaluate those across the 3 years that you're measuring. You have 2 pluses that, that means you get 2 pluses, 3 pluses across the board, you get full points. 2 pluses and a neutral, and you're this many points. You could certainly construct something that way that allows the individual years to be kind of a bellwether for the institution to understand what direction they're headed for that ultimate 3-year average. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head that what Andrew showed, I don't recall having seen that, and that just, if that's a path that folks are interested in, there are ways to kind of shore that up a little bit and make them less positive or negative. Like the way that's constructed, it's most likely that people will either be a positive or a negative, because it's pretty unlikely, except where you see it in some small school cases, that everybody's going to have the exact same percentage that they had the prior year. And if you're not putting some kind of confidence interval around that, you may be making decisions that are non-substantive. Just they don't really reflect anything meaningful. They're just slight variations from one year to the next.
This is Ann. So wouldn't this also, or would this, maybe I should say, also go with our kind of model of competing against yourself, so to say? I feel like the coefficient would go along with that model that we've done with diversity. Yes or no?
Yeah, I think so. I don't mean to kind of, I feel like I'm going off in different hypotheses that I haven't really discussed with anybody, but I mean, as long as we're just talking, that raises a very interesting point, Anne, where you could, instead of constructing a confidence interval around what was, you could, what last year was and that range for this coming year, you could also think about this as seeing where every district is, constructing a projection for what that you want them to achieve, a reasonable projection, and then bound that reasonable projection by a confidence interval. So if you're within that confidence interval, even though you didn't hit the actual target, if you're within the confidence, you're shooting for a range rather than just a specific number, which you're either going to meet dead on, not meet, or exceed. And again, that, the exceeds part, I don't think any of us want to give credit for let's say this situation happened. I have an EPP, my EPP cohort. I have a group of students that are accepted, and I've met, I've at least met my target based on that acceptance rate. And one of my white students drops out and decides not to come. So then your minority rate would be increased by, let's say, a tenth or a half of a percentage point. Is that a meaningful change? Does that represent growth and improvement for you? I would argue no. So you would want it on both sides. In order to get and exceed your expectation, you'd have to clear the upper bound of the confidence interval. To get a did not meet your expectation, you'd have to fall below the confidence interval. So it's a way of doing that gives, avoids just these small, tiny incremental changes being interpreted as some kind of quality aspect.
Tom, could you have, I can't remember where we left this, on other domains, a situation where you had two subcomponents. One is goal number one, don't fall out of your band, meaning don't get worse.
Yeah.
Two, increase your N. So, I forgot our number at Wilmington, 49. We set a goal for increasing 49. So we ultimately end up with sub-goals within this. One, the more conservative goal, stay within your band. Number two, grow that in.
Yeah, I think, what you're suggesting here is at a sub, your overall measure is going to be the result of your performance on two subdomains, which I think strengthens your overall measure.
Right.
And you can have, when you say the N, do you specifically mean the N of the number of diverse, minority students in your program, or is the N just the overall increase in the number of students?
Well, I'm assuming the N in the chart is the number of non-white completers.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think you could have both those things. And that would definitely guard against improving your percentage by excluding white candidates.
Right.
Which nobody's advocating for that, but that would guard against that.
And the reason for suggesting that, and I will slay the statistical language here, if you look at other data points of the model, those are individual performances. So we have the aggregate of these performers in this year on EdTPA. This one's different. It's an analysis of a cohort, and it's also an analysis of this year's production of graduates, in essence. So something about having both of those there reflects this domain's a little different from the other domains. It was a lot different from the other domains, but that aspect in particular. So you're building a cohort, or at least maintaining a cohort, while you're also trying to increase the number of graduates, because ultimately you could do fabulous things to change a cohort, but if you're not producing more graduates, what was the point of the more diverse cohort? In essence, they never finish.
Right.
Or some,
You're specific. Oh, so that's it. I think I just caught something you said there that I didn't realize before. Or you're talking about the number of completers, not about the number of admits.
This is Andrew. Just for a point of clarity, the calculation was based on completers, not admits.
Okay. So yeah, that makes sense to me. Yes, that makes sense to me. I get you, man. Who cares if the percentage is going up if the number of completers is not going up as well?
Right, and ultimately that that links it back over to the Drive Task Force, because we could be doing a wonderful job of increasing the diversity of EPPs, but we're not increasing the aggregate effect on the profession because we're losing students in the EPP part of the pipeline.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a critical observation, Van, because organizations who have made concerted efforts to take this work on, I think often find that the diversifying happens first. But if you don't build an inclusive culture and have kind of an outcome, an equitable outcomes orientation, you can get stuck at the diversity stage and lose people or have them not complete.
Whoever's typing furiously, A, it's impressive, and B, make sure that you're muted. All right, so let's just a quick roundabout here. What are other people thinking about this? Does this sound like a viable strategy? Because what I'd like to do is think next about the domain itself. But let's see if anybody is opposed to this strategy.
So I'm going to ask a clarification question because I think I was following what Van and what Tom were saying, but I'm not sure where we landed. I like the notion of the confidence interval that is forcing us out of status quo, but I want to make sure that's where we landed, or perhaps we're still trying to figure out where to land.
To ask Anthony's question in reverse, is there an objection to including the confidence interval component?
This is Dan. Would it be possible to have like a small set of data done with that just to see what it looked like? I really like the example. Certainly want Tom and Andrew and Kim to have more things to do, so.
No, we can certainly do that, but I want to push, if that is the thinking, I want to push the thinking of this group on the Tennessee side of things, because remember the diversity component for Tennessee was you could achieve what you needed to do on the diversity side by meeting it one of three ways. And so I'm wondering how this confidence interval variable plays into the other two variables that we have access to. Do we need them? Should we get rid of them? Should we have a discussion about the weighting? Like how do those other things play into the calculation?
So I'm a little bit concerned if we don't have multiple ways, right? And just looking at this from a sheer end perspective, right? Look at 2018, 2019. I would be concerned if you had a program like Charlotte that ended up with a sanction, yet they are so far ahead of everybody else right now. Right, their N is 125, and to only have a way, and I don't know what a confidence interval looks like for them. If in the next year they have a decline, even if it's a small decline, like how does that impact programs? And we've got a couple, we've got some of these bigger programs, double digits and stuff. So I don't know. I'm a little bit worried about sanctioning programs that are appear to be doing the job, right?
Yeah, so I hear that, and hopefully, Tom, you're still on. I'm wondering, could this confidence interval strategy be a yes/no, like the other two variables that we have cooked for diversity in this Tennessee model?
So, for the other two strategies, refresh my memory on what the other two strategies.
So the three strategies are: one, setting a state standard, and what all I did there was take the average of the percentage of non-white candidates across the state, which was slightly under 20%. I set a 20% standard. Did you make that or not? Yes or no? If you're yes, you're good to go. Second one was, how does your EPP percent non-white compare to the institution percent non-white? And if you meet or exceed that, then yes or no, right? And then we're talking about this confidence interval as a third route.
Well, actually, you're not talking about the confidence interval as a third route. You're talking about
Or growth.
growth, yeah, relative to the prior year. Yeah.
Right.
So I could see a situation where you could construct confidence intervals around all three of those measures, which may be a smart thing to do. Now, I will say for the first one, the state average, you would have to, so there's percentages around these confidence intervals. You'd have to have a much lower confidence interval, that I'm talking like 80% confidence interval or somewhere around that, around the state measure, because the confidence interval is going to be so small that you're probably talking about a point on either side, if that. So that one would have to stretch out a bit in order to give you a reasonable range when you're trying to hit the state average. When we talk, yeah. So then on the second one, I think you could do the same thing where you're looking at the institution. There, you would construct the confidence interval around the institution population, not around the EPP. The EPP is just measured at where it is, but does its measure fall within the established confidence range for the IHE? And that is, yeah, so you could do it for all three of them.
Okay. Well, I mean, we can certainly put that together, and then as just a point of thinking here, if our current thinking around the model was domain 1 at 55%, domain 2 at 10%, and domain 3 at 35%, where we did not include diversity into the component, what 2 or 3 ranges would you like for me to calculate, come up with some models to send out to everybody? What's the thinking there? Where do you want to rob points, percentage points from, give to diversity, and how much do you want to give weight on the diversity side?
Andrew, while we're thinking, can I ask a question about the UNC Charlotte row?
What tab are you looking at?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on D4 growth. D4% growth. Help me understand what I'm missing. So UNC Charlotte's percent non-white completers increased by 1.5%, 1.7% over 22.1. But the head count went from 58 to 125. Those two things to me, they don't line up.
That does seem weird.
So I'm wondering if the 125 is something else, because the 1.7 is not going to calculate to 100% increase.
Yeah, I'll double check that.
Yeah.
Not unless they had a really, really large class that year.
Yeah. Or they ran a grant. Yeah, I mean, I think the 125 is my guess is probably a typo, but.
Yeah, I'll poke around here while you guys are discussing how you want to calculate the grant accountability model, and I'll see if I can come up with where I got that.
So I think, Andrew, it's not it's not going to be that difficult to calculate those confidence intervals at the, I would recommend starting off with 5, 10, and 20% confidence intervals. And then, or I should say it the other way, 95, 90, and 80% confidence intervals. And then, you know, let everybody on here see the range that provides for each of the measures.
Okay.
I think you could have different confidence intervals across the subdomains, but you couldn't have different confidence intervals for different schools within a subdomain.
Okay. I had to think about that for a second. So how much, without, I'm just trying to get my head around how much weight you want to give diversity in the grand equation, the grand calculation of the 4 domains. How much weight do you want to give it?
Andrew, can you pull that chart or model or the flow chart you have up so we can just see the percentages?
Kim, can you go to tab 1 there, 4 domain model, and scroll over so you get towards the end there. Keep going to the right. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. That's the weighted domains there on BH to BJ. Again, this is really hard to do visually and remotely. I apologize for that. And I don't know that that's going to. Right now, I'm more interested in just what your gut would tell you, without going into let's see what all of them are. If you had those 4 domains that you had to look at, you know, domain 1 being the effectiveness data. Domain 2 is some sort of a retention data. Domain 3 is a survey of stakeholders, so that's the employer survey and the recent graduate survey data. Domain 4 being diversity. I think the consensus from this group earlier was that domain 1 is the domain that you have the most control over, and domain 3 was second place, and retention you had the least amount, but you wanted to acknowledge it because it was something that was in the you know, what folks were thinking about over at the legislative side. I just want to get your sense as to what you value now when we put issues of diversity into the grand equation.
I'll start at 50-10, 30-10.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna go that as well, either that or 55-10, 25-10. One way to, yeah.
Okay. That helps, and I just wanted to get, you know, even a starting point there, that helps me, so I can work a couple of models up from that, so that you have some fuel to think about that. For time's sake, we have, what, 15 minutes, Kim? Unmute yourself.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Since we have 15 minutes, I would like to draw your attention, and Kim, if you could pull it up, the little the graphic flow chart that I have. I just want to make sure, the one thing that we sort of didn't resolve in the last meeting was, are we okay with the amount of time all those different circumstances in accountability play into an institution being able to turn it around? And then I think Dr. Dempsey was asking, hey, can we put something together that we look at this slightly differently, which is what I built. And you can see there, you know, you could have seen there for a second, getting that up here. And hopefully you guys have this as a handout as well, but this is just trying to get a different visualization of what is already cooked into law. And if you're looking at this and you're saying, wow, that doesn't seem like enough, or it seems adequate, I think knowing that would be very helpful going forward, because Tom and I did actually mention to the JLEOC that the idea of turning an institution around it does take time, and we have to be very careful that we're giving adequate time to do that. So from the people who have the institutional perspective, Dr. Graham, Dr. Marr, Dr. Weddington, Dr. Dempsey, Dr. Bullock in particular, when you look at those different variables that are in sanctions, do you think that those are all ample and sufficient amount of time to turn things around, or do you feel like we should be very concerned if an institution heads down this one particular path, they're going to be in big trouble, and they likely can't turn it around?
This is Ann. So I would say there would be some issue with time when we think about, I'm going from the logic that Van was saying earlier about it takes 2 years to get people to count. And if you only have 2 years to pull it together, then whoever your county is already in your queue, so to say. There's not anybody new in your queue. Don't worry about that.
Right, so I think what you're saying there, Dr. Bullock, is that the point at which you have identified that this is a concern, you have to have no less than 3 years to be able to effectively turn it around, because in theory, in many instances, the pipeline is already cooked for the next 2 years. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That's correct. If this is for traditional, if you're looking at the percentage of EPs that are traditionally prepared for your, like if it's an MAT program, earlier, but if you're talking about one size fits all, that's going to be your longest route.
Other thoughts?
Andrew, if you take the earliest route to revocation is to miss 3 subgroups, and then you have to do it 3 years in a row. And so in the 4th year, that's when the revocation would begin.
Yeah, that is correct. And the answer could be no. It seems fair, and that's stable, and we don't have to think about that for the moment.
And in that worst, looking at it as a dean, in that worst case scenario, with the worst case being in 3 years, if you're missing 3 subgroups, if you get at least one of the subgroups better in year 2 or year 3, you have then extended your timeline for total program improvement out to the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th year.
Right.
You have to get better all at once.
That's right. So in order for you to achieve that fastest route to revocation, the wheels would have to have fallen off on a number of areas of your program and stay that way for a number of years as well. And again, I know, back to what Mr. Lakis was saying, is I think that's exactly right. The idea is that this group is going to champion the notion back to the lawmakers. Please, for heaven's sakes, don't go down that sanction path. Instead, do a weighted composite, because when you set it up this way, you could be causing some potential challenges out there that are not necessarily intended. So that's obviously the primary position, but I just wanted to get your take on this as well, given the current model when we hand it back to the JLEOC. In terms of, I guess we're not hearing a lot of pushback on that. So perhaps the sanctions, it would be preferable for it to be in a weighted composite, but you're seeing, at least in this flow chart, that from the institution folks' perspective, that you have at least sufficient enough time to demonstrate that you're turning it around. That's what I'm sensing.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, Tom and Kim, I think what I'm hearing in this is some possible closure here, is that we'll build some confidence intervals across the three subcategories or subdomains of domain 4. We'll build that out across three confidence intervals, 95, 90, and 80. Across those three, take a look at that. And then from that, we will then look up some sort of a weighted composite average. The two areas that I heard from the group was 50-10, 30-10, and 55-10, 25-10, and see what those look like. So to me, it sounds like we should be able to flip that in a couple of days and get that out to everybody. And then if people feel like that's heading in the right direction, then I think we're getting to a point of closure here in response, and we'll then move to try and get the three board members back together to think about what their take is on this before we move it to the commission for a vote. Does that sound like we've captured the past hour and 23 minutes?
I just wanted to ask if Ann had a vote on a certain weight.
Okay.
Series,
are there any other
because
weights?
Ann was the one that I didn't get the vote for.
We voted on something?
For the weighting
I
for
think
each
I
of the
looked at
domains.
Yeah, we're not voting on anything, and we just wanted your input on the two weightings of the composite. Do you have any other?
No, I thought we were going to try both and see how they look.
Okay.
Well, did you have a preference, Ann, or did you have a different one from the ones that were provided?
The one was 55 and one was 60, right? Something like that, 50 and 30.
It was 55, 15, 15, 15, 55, 10, 25, 10, and 50, 10, 30, 10.
I don't know that I have a real difference on that. I think the NTPA should be higher than the other.
Okay, I'll just make that note then, because I had made notes about everyone else. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
And Andrew Lake has said, we can run that third one just to see what it looks like. I mean, to calculate that's not a heavy lift.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not married to it. I generally think the survey's percentage feels a little inflated. But I'd be curious to see what it does if you ran the numbers. I could easily move to 55, 10, 25, 10 that Michael and Hank suggested.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts for the good of the cause? I think we have our marching orders. Did I miss anything? Anything else that you want to get on our radar?
appreciate everybody's discourse and all the hard work y'all putting into this. Feels like we're making some progress.
Yeah, I feel like
The
we moved
next-
the needle today. Good.
Sure. Just a question, our next steps after these weights and the confidence intervals are done, we're sending that through email to everyone, is that correct?
That is correct. And then if we get, if we get some, Kim, you and I will be creative about capturing some information from everybody.
Sure.
And depending on what we get from that, we will either have to reconvene this group or we will move to get the 3 board members back with a couple of folks here just to get their take on it. And if everything is stable, we'll move it to the full commission.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Be safe, and we'll be in touch here in a couple days with some email. And if you have any questions or any ideas between now and then, just reach out, okay?
All right. Be safe, everybody.
Thank y'all.
Have a good holiday weekend.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Have a good holiday, everybody.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.